Good day. This is Rhonda reading from the Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins by Burton L. Mack. Part 4, The Reconception of Christian Origins. 4.1, Jesus and Authority. The discovery of Q has forced a revision of the history of Christian beginnings. It has also demanded a shift in the way we understand early Christian myth-making. Q documents a Jesus movement that produced a myth of origin simply by adding new sayings to a growing collection of the instructions of a founder teacher. Such a mode of myth-making has been difficult for modern scholars to accept. Early Christian myths of origin have usually been classified as charismatic or narrative. Q has expanded the options and thus invites a special consideration. What we need to understand is the process by which sayings continued to be ascribed to Jesus long after he lived. The traditional criteria for determining the authentic words of the historical Jesus are no longer valid. The question must now focus on the inauthentic teachings. New Testament scholars know that Jesus could not have said everything ascribed to him in the vast literature produced during the first 3 or 4 centuries. A recent collection of the sayings of Jesus from early Christian literature numbers 503 items by Crossan, 1986. Excuse me. Of these, less than 10% are considered candidates for authenticity by scholars working on this question. The traditional quest for the authentic words of Jesus focused primarily on the criteria for determining which sayings are authentic. Sayings that occur in Gnostic treatises or in the popular literature traditionally called, oh boy, this is a tough one, pseudepigraphical, or falsely written and signed, have easily been set aside. No critical scholar thinks that Jesus said, "Cleave wood, I am there. Lift a stone, you will find me there," as found in the Gospel of Thomas, saying 77. No one doubts that the author of the Gnostic treatise called Pistis Sophia invented Jesus' instructions to his disciples about the fall, repentance, and salvation of Pistis Sophia. And the time came that she should be saved from the chaos and brought forth from all the darkness. And the first mystery sent me a great light power from the height, so that I should help the Pistis Sophia and bring her up from the chaos. Pistis Sophia 1, page 60, or, or chapter 60. I'm not sure. And there is absolute embarrassment about the words of the child Jesus found in the infancy Gospels. When slapped on the face by another child, for instance, Jesus, the 6-year-old, told him to finish his course, so that he died forthwith. Infancy Gospel of Thomas, chapter 4, verse 1. The sayings that occur in the canonical Gospels are a bit more tricky. Scholars have no trouble thinking that the words of Jesus in the Gospel of John were invented in the course of the community's meditations. Sayings such as, "I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever." Or, "He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life," are simply dismissed as Johannine. But the sayings ascribed to Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels have proven to be very difficult to assign. That is because New Testament scholars have assumed the image of Jesus created by the narrative Gospels and thus have found it hard to discount self referential sayings, excuse me, that in any other mouth would be found highly inappropriate. The criteria for judging authenticity have all been forms of a single persuasion, namely that since Jesus was a unique individual, his teachings must have been novel. The difference between the sayings of Jesus and what others might have said has therefore been the major consideration for determining authenticity. A saying with parallels from Jewish or Greek traditions of proverbs and maxims would therefore be discounted. Sayings that address the theological or ethical concerns of the emerging church have likewise been considered inauthentic. Studies based on such criteria have not been without value, for they have situated many of the teachings of Jesus in appropriate traditions of discourse and demonstrated the inauthenticity of the majority of sayings ascribed to Jesus. But the short lists of authentic words that result from such an endeavor lack coherence, fail to enhance the picture of Jesus scholars had in mind, and do nothing to help explain the practice of ascribing the sayings to Jesus that scholars have called inauthentic. Meanwhile, consternation reigns outside of scholarly circles when people are told that Jesus did not say what Mark or Matthew or Luke said he said. Such consternation has been documented time after time in letters to the editors of newspapers in response to the published judgments of the Jesus Seminar. This group of New Testament scholars has been at work for several years preparing the scholars' red letter edition of the Gospels from Funk 1992, with the aim of summing up the best judgments of critical scholars in the quest for the authentic teachings of Jesus. Preliminary results of the voting with red, pink, gray, and black beads have regularly been published in the media. And then indignation is expressed by Christians who have always imagined that Jesus said what the scholars now say he did not. Part of the problem is that the Jesus Seminar has not been able to explain to the public how it arrives at its conclusions. When it has tried, the frightful lack of basic knowledge about the formation of the New Testament among average Christians has blocked the conversation. But even so, the explanations that are given fail to convince because the criteria for authenticity are still beholden to the notion of a unique Jesus. With such a Jesus in mind, there is really no way of deciding which saying is authentic and which is not. Authentic turns out to be a theological category, not a helpful term for understanding Christian origins. The consternation of average Christians needs to be taken more seriously. What they are troubled about has to do with the reverse side of the notion of authenticity, namely, with the notion of inauthenticity. What they are saying is that if Matthew said Jesus said it, and Jesus did not say it, then Matthew was lying, or he was mistaken, or he invented it and did not tell his readers. Their question then is, how could he have done that? It is very easy to explain how Matthew or the people of Q could have done it. The explanation may not be comfortable for some Christians, but it is eminently understandable, given some historical background on teachers, teachings, and their followers in the Greco Roman age. Historians of the period have this information, and it is fully apropos in a book about Q. Thus, this chapter is devoted to Greco Roman attitudes and practices with regard to the sayings or maxims of a teacher. We shall see that these attitudes were different from our modern sensibilities about the authenticity of sayings attributed to a certain author. It has always been shown that the authors of early Christian texts feel free to attribute new sayings to Jesus. The point has been made that these sayings were appropriate to the views of Jesus current in an author's tradition and to the social circumstances under which an author wrote. This means that attribution was acceptable if judged appropriate. What we need to understand is the criterion by which people in antiquity measured appropriateness when ascribing a given saying to a known figure. In the cultures of antiquity, proverbs, maxims, and pithy formulations were an extremely important form of discourse at all levels of society. Great sayings crystallized the insights of a people in memorable form and became commonplace theorems that everyone used to interpret and master the common events of the daily round. A bit of skill and perhaps a wink would be required to put a certain construction under some action in want of explanation. But that was fully understood by everyone as part of the challenge of living, and a clever application of an old adage was considered a mark of wisdom. See a pen and pick it up. All the day you will have good luck. Might apply in some ways, not in others, to an occasion of picayune behavior, but saying it would nevertheless acknowledge the moment and might be quite enlightening. Proverbs were generated among the people, but collected by scribes at temple schools, the courts of the kings, and the centers where schools of philosophy flourished. Collecting proverbs was a scholarly enterprise, and a collection of a certain kind of proverb would normally be attributed to a figure of the past renowned for his wisdom. Thus, we have the Proverbs and Wisdom of Solomon as books in the Bible. In the wisdom literatures of Egypt and the ancient Near East, there is also a large number of collections of various kinds of wise sayings attributed to some courtier or sage. During the Greco Roman age, collecting sayings flourished at centers of learning, attributing them to a legendary sage, poet, or founder of a Greek school was the major method of classification. The, oh boy, um, nomol, nomologium, it's spelled Gnomologium, or sayings collection, was looked on as an important way to conserve the wisdom of the past in a time of change. Thus, we have the maxims of Theogenes, the nomology to Cyrus, the monostichoi, or one-liners, of Menander, the Kyriai doxai, or principal teachings, of Epicurus, the sentences of Sextus, and so on. In the case of authors whose written works were available, a collection might begin by excerpting quotations, but it would soon become a repository for other sayings in a kind. A coherent collection of sayings was highly regarded as a distillation of a particular wise man's wisdom and would attract other sayings in kind to the collection in his name. Preoccupation with the sayings of the sages was not merely an expression of antiquarian interest. and collecting them was not done just to conserve the truisms of the past. Working with the sayings of the wise was driven by an interest in what the Greeks called ethos, or what we would call character. Character for Greeks was not a matter of personality or a matter of what we would call ethics. The modern notion of ethics is moralistic and assumes generally agreed upon standards of virtue. The Greek notion of character had to do with an individual's distinctive lifestyle. It was closer to what we moderns mean when we say that a person is a character. A character for the Greeks had a profile created by a consistent pattern of behavior and a corresponding mode of speech. The Greeks understood how important words were and that what one said on a given occasion made a difference. What one said revealed one's stance toward another as well as one's view of the world. Speech was also a behavioral mode, but one that was capable of manipulating deception. Characters were therefore judged by the correspondence between what they said and what they did, or how they usually behaved. If a person was a teacher, one's character was judged by whether one lived according to the teachings one espoused. If the character of a teacher had been determined, the sayings of the teacher could be used to represent that character. Founders of the various schools of philosophy were regarded as characters that embodied the teachings of their schools. Thus, the sayings of a sage or a teacher were understood to be an expression of their character. Since sayings were assessed as the expression of a particular view of life, and since word and deed were understood to match in the ideal character, the ascription of sayings to ideal figures was a matter of appropriateness. Thus, even the truisms coined and in circulation during a later time would be called for appropriate attribution to the collections of this or that philosopher or sage from a previous period. Founders of schools regularly got credit for the philosophies that developed in the school tradition in their name. Because character was defined by the correspondence of espousal, mode of speech, and lifestyle, profiles of an individual in action were also of great interest. Thus, biographical literature burgeoned during the Greco Roman period. The problem, of course, was that most of the figures thought to be worthy of a biography were dead and gone, and, lacking documentation, it was impossible to trace the course of a person's life. There were, however, lore and other forms of legacy about public figures. If an important individual had left a written legacy, it could be used to infer the kind of person he had been and the way of life he had espoused and followed. So even the scripts of the tragic and comic poets were pored over centuries later for clues as to which sayings, perspectives, and speeches expressed the author's own views, and from them biographies could be written. In the case of kings, commanders, and statesmen, there were histories, eulogies, family lore, and letters that could be used. And circulating among the adherents of the various schools of philosophy were countless anecdotes about founders and their disciples. All of this material could be used in composing a biography, or as the Greeks called it, a bios or life. Okay. We have a remarkable collection of anecdotal material about the founders of philosophical schools in the lives of eminent philosophers, written by Diogenes Laertius around 200 CE. I'm sure I didn't pronounce that well. He mentions numerous collections of memorabilia, anecdotes, maxims, and biographies that he used as the sources for his own compendium. His overall plan was to trace the sequence of the Greek school traditions by writing a life of each founder and successive head of a school, beginning with the seven sages and working through the classical period to about the first century BCE. The typical life begins with the mention of what was known about a person's family, home, hometown, teachers, and star pupils. It then turns into, excuse me, it then turns to a registry of the philosopher's teachings. A list of the philosopher's known works is included by title, but instead of summarizing his philosophy in treatise form, Diogenes usually used the format of memorable sayings. Included are apothegms, meaning terse formulations of the know thyself variety, maxims, precepts, advice in imperative formulation, doxai, meaning succinct summary statements of the teacher's opinions on a particular philosophical or ethical issue, and dogmata, meaning the philosophical principles of the school. But what about character? Lacking the kind of information modern biographers use to trace the course of a person's life, Diogenes provided his readers with with numerous pictures of the person on this or that occasion. These he referred to as lore, meaning to legomenon, reminiscence, um, meaning apopneuma. Oh, sorry about that. And anecdote, tria. Reading through the 82 lives in Diogenes' history, it is remarkable how different the character profiles become simply by comparing these snapshot like images and saying. The, the tria, or anecdote, is a particularly interesting building block of the Greek biography. It consisted of a brief hint or description of a typical situation, plus a succinct formulation of a person's response. It could be reduced to the form when asked, so and so said, or on seeing, so and so said or did. As one can see, what a philosopher might have said or done on a given occasion counted as a test of character. Sayings in this form did double duty. One could check to see if they fit the teacher's espoused philosophy, and one could also assess their appropriateness as a response to a situation. Anecdotes were used in the schools of rhetoric as examples of effective speech. Since they contained the basic ingredients of a rhetorical situation, speaker, speech, and audience, anecdotes could be analyzed for their appropriateness to the character of the speaker to which they were attributed, ethos, their fit with the espousals or teachings of the teacher, logos, and their rhetorical effectiveness as an address to the listeners, known as pathos. Anecdotes could also be memorized, restylized, coined, paraphrased, and embellished into scenarios with full blown speeches. Finding the right words when composing a speech for a certain character was considered a skill. To compose a speech, even for oneself, one needed to find the right words. The Greeks called this heuresis, or discovery. The Romans, who learned their rhetoric from the Greeks, translated heuresis to inventio, or invention. Either way, finding the right words or making them up. Rhetoric was understood as a collage approach to composition, putting together materials already at hand in novel combinations. That is because a speech, to be effective, had to draw upon common language, stock figures, telling metaphors, interesting analogies, and well known examples from popular and literate discourse. The trick was to find the right phrase or appropriate image to make the point. The real test, however, was to write a speech for someone else. This was called speech in character. Lawyers were trained to write speeches in character for their clients. Teachers were trained to write and perform speeches in character for public officials and ceremonial occasions that harkened back to hoary times. Biographers, historians, and playwrights were trained to compose speeches in character for every turn in the lives of their characters. Making a speech was how the Greeks described human encounter, and hearing a speech was how the Greeks registered the import of a given language, given exchange. Hellenism was a culture of rhetoric. The literature of the time is chock full of sayings and speeches. Speech making was the order of the public day. One got high marks for composing a fine speech, and higher marks still for composing a speech in character. Students learned to compose speeches in character in school. Quintilian, a teacher of rhetoric who lived during the first century, explained that to write a good speech, one needed to imagine oneself in the situation and the character of the speaker. If one chose to do so, one could even create a character by composing a persuasive speech appropriate to such a character. Students were asked to learn this skill by inventing speeches for imaginary situations, such as, what would a monkey say if he wanted to be the leader of the pack? Students were also asked to invent speeches for historical personages on specific memorable occasions, such as, what would Theseus have said when he learned that his father had committed suicide because Theseus had forgotten to change the color of the sails on his return to Athens. So the standards for judging the appropriateness of a speech attributed to a particular person had little to do with the modern notions of historical truth, but much to do with ethos, or the correspondence of a person's speech and character. But now a shift in sensibility took place during the early Roman period that needs a bit of explanation before we return to the sayings of Jesus in Q. The point has been made that character or ethos was a neutral concept without moralistic connotation. This insight remains valid for the period and needs to be kept firmly in mind. Characterization had to do with the correspondence of speech, espousal, and lifestyle. No matter what kind of lifestyle was projected, this does not mean, however, that the Greeks were incapable of rendering judgment about the way to live. They simply tackled this question in ways other than those to which we are accustomed. The important factor was the philosophy one followed as a guide for living one's life. Thus, the question of the best way to live was a matter of espousal, of alignment with some philosophical school. Each of the many philosophical schools had its own ideas about what was good, right, noble, and so forth. These values were debatable in antiquity, and a given character would be discussed not in personal terms, but in relation to issues under debate among the philosophical schools. The shift that took place during the early Roman period was that a largely Stoic popular philosophy became the generally preferred standard for a lifestyle of independence and personal integrity appropriate to the times. And this in turn affected the ranking of ideal character types. There are hints in the educational literature of the first century that this shift in sensibility was widespread and had pushed educators into serious reflection about the role of classical education in a period of cultural transition. One begins to read cautionary advice to teachers about using only approved speeches from the canons of classical literature or lesson material, and about using only approved sayings and maxims when learning to elaborate a thesis. There is also advice about using only the judgments, maxims, and sayings of approved sages in arguments for a thesis. If we were to ask what the standards for approval were, we would probably encounter a popular Stoic philosophy that encouraged individual integrity without rocking the social boat. If, however, we were to ask why the concern focused on the selection and ranking of speech material, we would stumble upon a very interesting social psychology of the time. A friend of Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and advisor to Nero, asked him for a copy of a certain collection of sayings. In a letter, Seneca said that he would comply with the request, but wondered why his friend wanted them. He went on to advise his friend about the selection and use of sayings, indicating that one should be extremely careful because not every collection was worth having. Choose wisely and knowingly, Seneca said, because conversatio, or frequent use, intimate contact, with the sayings of a philosopher would have the effect of reproducing the character of the author in the reader. He did not know how this happened, he said, but he was sure that it did happen. One should therefore take care, knowing that the kinds of sayings one found interesting would have their effect. Conversatio was Seneca's term for describing the way in which literate persons in late antiquity read and treated their texts. Learning to read and write in antiquity was a laborious process governed at every level by copying called mimesis, in Latin imitatio, from which we get imitating, and memorization. From learning letters to composition, the procedure was the same. The student was presented with paradigms, sayings, and model compositions to be mastered by careful repetition. This fixed the patterns in one's mind. Then there was rehearsal, reading aloud, and a presentation of the material from memory. Only then would slight elaborations be countenanced on such as experimenting with changes in the tone of voice and paraphrase, giving the meaning in other words. Imitation aimed at what we would call the internalization of a model composition by making the model one's own and being able to present it as if it were one's own composition. The skilled and the gifted were expected eventually to compose what we would call original and creative pieces, but this was reserved for the few and was still understood as a process of bricolage, or finding the right figure for making a point from the vast reservoir of already well formulated sayings and figures in the literary and cultural tradition. Seneca knew that conversatio with a collection of sayings would have its influence on the reader. His concern was that the sayings one selected represent the kind of character one would be happy or willing to become. The assumption underlying the concern was that the sayings of an author were a sufficient vehicle of ethos, and that by making them one's own, a person would take on that ethos. We need not delve into the correctness of Seneca's social psychology or discourse theory before returning to the question of attribution in Q. We need only see that the sayings of a sage had become a most significant genre for the transmission of what the Greeks called ethos, and that ethos was a fundamental notion in the definition of culture and enculturation. In the mentality of Greco-Roman age, the sayings of an author were an expression of a particular ethos. Other sayings that corresponded to that ethos could easily be attributed to that author. And by cultivating those sayings, one could imitate and internalize that ethos. Ethos, not personality, was the important thing. This mentality was taken for granted throughout the Hellenistic world, and it gives us the proper cultural context for understanding the way in which the Jesus movements treated Jesus' sayings. Jesus was regarded as a wise teacher whose sayings were a sufficient index to the ethos he represented. The metaphor used by the people of Q that corresponds to Seneca's conversatio was to keep or to hear and do Jesus' sayings. This indicates not only the importance that was placed on Jesus' sayings, but also that they were the object of cultivation in the discourse of the movement. Loyalty to the movement was registered in terms of hearing and doing these words. And because of the tight relationship, excuse me, and because of the tight relation between word and deed and the notion of ethos, one's loyalty to the movement was the same as one's loyalty to Jesus, whose image idealized the ethos of the school, his school. Thus, the genre of a collection of sayings was not a weak or insufficient foundation for a movement of followers in Jesus' name. It was a powerful and fully sufficient vehicle for a movement engaged in the formation of a group with a particular ethos. The question of attribution should now be capable of resolution, but for the fact that the types of sayings attributed to Jesus changed in the course of Q's history and the history of other Jesus movements during the early period. We have been able to account for new sayings by referring to shifts in the discourse of the movement. Such shifts can be related to changes in the movement's social circumstance, experience, and formation. These changes are clearly reflected in the layering and reworking of the Q tradition. Now we need to ask how the people of Q managed to attribute sayings to Jesus that expressed an ethos different from the image and voice of the Jesus to which they had been accustomed. Several observations will help. One would be that these shifts in characterization did not occur precipitously, but took place incrementally over time. The strata we have used to chart the history of the movement's development are literary moments accidentally available to us because of compositional features of the text. In actuality, one needs to imagine a vigorous gift and take as groups discussed their options, shared insights, and voice frustrations. By slowing down the experimental process, one can easily imagine a normal process of attribution. At any point in the process, the group must have been familiar with a particular image of Jesus. At this point, attribution of sayings in kind was possible by any of the usual means customary for the times. We might note, for instance, that much of the material added to the collection in the course of elaboration and growth was proverbial already at hand in the cultures of context. Adding such material would not have required great ingenuity. Slight shifts in characterization would also have been possible as long as they were felt to be elaborations or embellishments appropriate to the image already in place. If one could imagine that the Jesus of the familiar sayings could also have said such and such, that would be enough to allow consideration of the comment. At some later point, supposing that the accumulation of sayings contained an intolerable ethical tension, it might be necessary to recast the character of Jesus by speech attribution and other narrative devices. As we have seen, that is exactly what the people of Q had to do and did do. The most important observation, however, is that the image of Jesus shifted in tandem to changes in the sayings attributed to him. There is no indication that the people of Q were interested in or worried about the personality of Jesus. Jesus was as important as the founder teacher of the movement, but only in relation to the function of his teachings within the movement. The attributed teachings were the expression of the group's ethos and behavior. They were also the standard by which the voice and image of Jesus were continually recast. His character and role were enhanced in keeping with the expansion of the community's discourse. When the discourse shifted to include an epic apocalyptic perspective, for instance, authorization was achieved by imagining Jesus as wisdom's child. The authority of Jesus was firmly attached to the authorship of his instructions to the community. But authorship was not understood as we moderns understand it. In the modern sense of the term, the Jesus people were the authors of the sayings they attributed to Jesus. But as they understood what they were doing, it was a matter of inventing appropriate speech and character. They did this in order to authorize the agreements they reached on the ethos of a discourse appropriate to their times. Thus, the history of the Q community can be traced by noting the shifts in its discourse documented in its collection of the sayings of Jesus. A first stage comes to light with the aphorisms of Q1, noting that Q1 is composed of blocks of material that elaborate aphoristic material into rationalized codes. The aphorisms must reflect the discourse of the preceding period. Judging from these aphorisms, the discourse of the first stage was playful and the behavior behavior public. Individuals were challenging one another to behave with integrity despite the social consequences. A shift towards imperative forms of address indicates that some kind of association was practiced by these people. Another indication of this interest in association is the way in which the terminology of the rule of God is used. There are also a few hints that moments of encounter were used to construct human relationships, not merely to display individual virtue. If we ask about the character of the speaker of this kind of material, is it has its nearest analogy in contemporary profiles of the cynic sage. This is as close to the historical Jesus as Q allows us to get, but it is close enough for us to reconstruct a beginning of the movement that is both plausible and understandable. One should not underestimate the attraction of a cynic like sagery capable of enticing individuals into forming a discursive association. The blocks of material in Q1 represent a second stage. The aphoristic discourse of stage one was codified. Selected imperatives were elaborated as community rules by formulating argumentations to support their importance and reveal their appropriateness. Much of the material attributed to Jesus at this stage was proverbial wisdom taking the form of stock figures and comparisons. The public arena was still the setting for this kind of behavior, but there is also evidence that a network of small groups must have formed. There are signs of recognition and instructions concerning reception at a house that offers hospitality. A sense of expansion and growth is obvious, although there is no indication of a program to reform society or a demand for the conversation of would be members of the movement. This shift in discourse was easily attributed to Jesus. No attempt was made to recast his profile by narrative or descriptive means. And yet, the voice of Jesus was quite different from the speaker of the aphorisms. Jesus' voice was now that of a founder teacher giving instructions for the manner of life that should characterize his school. In the parlance of the Greek school traditions, Q1 represents Jesus' principal teachings or doctrines, doxai, dogmata. A third stage must be imagined for the period between Q1 and Q2. Such a shift in mood could not have happened overnight. The social distress registered in Q2 has to be considered. It cannot be explained as a weariness with reproach or discouragement born of dashed expectations. It gives every evidence of social conflict within close circles of acquaintance. Such an experience of conflict occasioned by one's association with the Jesus movement must have evolved gradually and resulted in painful separations. It would have been during this period that the language of judgment used by those involved in this conflict eventually settled into place as Jesus's own. The expansion of Jesus' repertoire from the instructions of a teacher to include prophetic pronouncements would have made it necessary to address the problem of redefining his character or role. Q2 gives evidence of a fourth stage, a period in which the group's investment in a movement with recognizable borders triggered reflection on its social place and purpose. Q2 is actually a myth of origin for the movement, although it would not have been thought of as such by the group and certainly was not imagined all at one time. Jesus had to authorize several kinds of pronouncements, and the process of attribution would have been ad hoc and experimental, moving from provisional allusions through the give and take of repeated expression and refinement to a situation in which some brave soul dared to insert a saying or two when making a copy of Q for a friend. By degrees, the voice of Jesus was heard uttering things that only the wisdom of God could have known. The whole sweep of history was now in review, but of course, the instruction Jesus had to offer from that grand perspective was not for the public ear. And so the voice of wisdom's child took on a tinge of revelation discourse, private knowledge for in house use as the community came to terms with its subcultural assignment. A fifth stage, documented in Q3, was distinctly different from all that had gone before. One wonders what happened to the people of Q during the Roman Jewish War. A retreat took place from the vigor with which these people had engaged their social environment to a kind of resignation and acceptance of the fact that the rule of God was a matter of personal and ethical integrity. An amazing accommodation seems to have been made with a Jewish piety against which earlier battles had been fought. And Jesus was heard quoting the scriptures, even though he now was imagined as the Son of God, whose kingdom would only be revealed at the end of time. These fuzzy profiles at the Q3 level, both of Jesus and of the community, give one the impression that the cost of surviving the war must have been very high. Q3 is not the only evidence we have for Jesus' movements generated by the cultivation of a collection of sayings, but it is the last bit of evidence for the people whose history we have followed. When next we catch sight of the document Q, it had been merged with narrative accounts that created their characterizations of Jesus quite differently. The marvel of the Q tradition is that characterization was achieved not by narration, but by artful ascription in the genre of a collection of sayings or instructions. The measure of their accomplishment is that this authorization of Jesus created a mythic figure with which each of the authors of the narrative gospels had to contend in order to appropriate Jesus in the composition of their stories. So that is the end of part 4.1. Part 4, the reconception of Christian origins. Part 4.1, entitled Jesus and Authority. Read from the book The Lost Gospel, The Book of Q, and Christian Origins by Burton L. Mack. Thank you for listening. Good day.